I'm Edward, and it's always a pleasure to spend this quiet time with you. Share with us where you're listening from, and are you the kind of person who falls asleep quickly or someone who takes a little longer to drift off? Be sure to subscribe so you can return for a new mystery every day. Now, let the story unfold. Chapter 1. A Voice in the Dark Corridor. And St Mary Mead was the sort of village that kept its own council and its own hours. The baker's boy arrived before 6, clattering his bicycle along the lane with a cheerfulness that the morning mist did nothing to diminish. Curtains were drawn at the same hour each evening and parted again at the same hour each dawn. The church clock marked the quarters with a dependable solemnity, and the postmistress, Mrs. Agnes Pritchard, opened the post office window at precisely 8:30. Our winter or summer, with an equanimity that her neighbours had long since ceased to remark upon, and had begun simply to rely on, as one relies upon the regularity of tides. Miss Jane Marple had lived in St Mary Mead for a considerable number of years, long enough to have observed the village through several generations of scandal, sorrow, and small triumph. She occupied a modest house set back from the lane, its garden rather better tended than its exterior might suggest, and she herself was a slight white-haired lady of indeterminate but advanced age, possessed of pale blue eyes that had a habit of resting upon a person with a gentle attentiveness that many found disarming and a few found unsettling. She knitted with the regularity of someone who finds in the click of needles a kind of ordered thinking, and she spoke with a diffident precision that concealed, from those who did not know her, a remarkably clear and penetrating intelligence. She was not, as a rule, given to fancies. It was therefore all the more notable that on a Thursday morning in late February, Miss Marple descended to breakfast in a state of quiet but unmistakable perturbation. The night had not been restful. Shortly before the dawn, at now she judged to be near 5 o'clock by the quality of the darkness and the distant stirring of the first birds, she had woken abruptly from a dreamless sleep with the firm impression that her name had been spoken. Not called, that precisely, not shouted, spoken in a low and urgent register, as one speaks when one wishes to be heard by a particular person and by no other. She had lain quite still for a moment, attending. The house offered nothing in return. The passage beyond her bedchamber door was silent. No footstep retreated along the floorboards. No gate swung in the garden below. The village itself seemed suspended in the particular hush that precedes first light, innocent of incident and entirely undisturbed. Miss Marple had risen, put on her dressing gown and gone to the door. The passage was empty. She had listened at the head of the stairs. Nothing. She had returned to bed and lain awake for some little while, not in alarm precisely, but in the alert and watchful state that her mind sometimes adopted when it sensed that a piece of information had arrived before she was prepared to understand it. She did not mention this at breakfast. It seemed, in the cold light of a February morning, the sort of thing one did not mention. People of sensible disposition did not report that they had heard their names spoken by no one. She poured her tea, ate her toast with a moderate appetite, and turned her attention to the garden, where a thrush was investigating the hard soil beneath the leafless rose bushes with admirable persistence. It was Mrs. Bantry's daily woman who brought the first word, arriving at the gate shortly before 11 with a parcel she had offered to deliver as an excuse, Miss Marple suspected, for the exchange of information she was rather clearly bursting to impart. Agnes Pritchard had not opened the post office. This was not, on its own, a thing of established significance. Illness came to all, and even the most reliable of persons occasionally succumbed. But Agnes had sent no word. The relief postmaster, a young man of uncertain temper who had come from Downley, had arrived to find the window still shuttered at 9 o'clock, and at 9:30, and at 10. He had applied at the cottage attached to the rear of the post office premises. He had knocked. He had received no answer. By noon, it had become apparent to those who concerned themselves with village affairs that Agnes Pritchard had left her cottage at some point, and had not returned, and had not, so far as anyone could determine, informed a single person of her intention to go anywhere at all. Miss Marple received this intelligence with the outward composure of a woman who has lived long enough to understand that composure is frequently the most useful instrument available. Inwardly, however, something shifted, as a puzzle piece shifts when one realizes that the edge one has been placing at the left of the picture belongs, in fact, at the right. She did not yet know what the connection was. She was not at all certain of even that a connection existed. It was entirely possible that Agnes had received news in the night, some family matter, some private urgency, and had departed by an early conveyance without stopping to leave word. It was possible, and it was the explanation that most of her neighbours were content to settle upon, at least for the present. Yet Miss Marple found herself returning, with a persistence she recognised as significant, to the sound that had woken her, the low, urgent quality of it. No, the sense it had carried of someone who needed to be heard. Agnes Pritchard was a woman of 53, small and neat, with brown hair greying at the temples and eyes of a warm, anxious hazel that suggested a disposition naturally inclined towards worry and naturally inclined also, perhaps, to suppress the evidence of it. She'd worked at the post office for 11 years, having come to St. Mary Mead following the death of her husband. A quiet and undistinguished man about whom she spoke seldom, but, when she did speak, with a fondness that was touching in its simplicity. She had no children. She had a cousin in Bath with whom she maintained a correspondence, and she had the village, which she served with a conscientiousness that went rather beyond the requirements of her position. She was not, by any account, the sort of woman who vanished without word. She had in fact been seen the previous afternoon. Or Miss Marple herself had passed her at the garden gate of the post office cottage, and Agnes had looked up from dead-heading a withered stem and offered a greeting. It had been a perfectly ordinary greeting, pleasantly delivered. But Miss Marple, who had long since trained herself to retain impressions rather than discard them, thought now that Agnes's eyes had carried something effortful about them. Not distress precisely, more the expression of a person who is managing a thing that requires managing. Miss Marple sat by her window that afternoon with her knitting in her lap, and thought about Agnes Pritchard, and about the voice in the dark corridor, and about the particular quality of managed composure in a kind and anxious face. She did not yet know what had happened. She did not in truth know that anything had happened at all, in any sinister sense. But something had begun. She felt it with the certainty of long experience, the same quiet certainty with which one feels, before the first cloud appears on the horizon, that the weather is about to change. The village went about its afternoon. The baker's cart came and went. A motor car belonging to Dr. Haydock passed along the lane at his customary unhurried pace. The church clock struck 3 and 4 and 5, and the winter light faded from the garden, and Miss Marple sat on and knitted, and thought, and waited for understanding to arrive. Chapter 2. The Unwatered Geraniums. By Friday morning, the matter of Agnes Pritchard's absence had progressed from the status of mild curiosity to something rather more substantial. It had acquired, as such things do in a village of limited population and considerable mutual acquaintance, a small community of devoted attention. Views were exchanged over garden walls, in the post office queue that now proceeded without its customary presiding intelligence, and across the counter of Tilling's, the general provision shop where Mrs. Tilling herself performed the ancient service of gathering and distributing information with a thoroughness that would have put many a professional organisation to shame. Miss Marple heard various accounts of the matter before 9 o'clock without having left her house, which was, she had found, frequently the most efficient method of research available to a person of her particular circumstances. Her daily woman, Dotty, arrived at 7:30 with the news that Agnes's front gate had been standing open since yesterday morning, which Dotty considered significant in itself. Agnes was, as Dotty put it, very particular about that gate, on account of Mrs. Fentiman's tabby cat, which had a habit of sleeping in Agnes's flower pots and doing considerable damage to the geraniums. The gate standing open was, therefore, the sort of small deviation from established practice that spoke, to those who knew Agnes, rather more loudly than might seem warranted to the uninitiated. This was the sort of observation that Miss Marple valued considerably. It was not the dramatic detail that revealed character, she had always thought, but the small domestic particular, the gate left ajar, the half-finished cup of tea, the library book renewed but never opened. Such things spoke with a precision that more conspicuous evidence rarely achieved. She therefore proposed, after a breakfast consumed with rather more expedition than was her habit, to call upon Agnes's cottage on the ostensible grounds of inquiring after the woman's welfare. It was the sort of call that required no elaborate justification in St. Mary Mead, where the checking in upon a neighbour represented an entirely unremarkable social act. Agnes's cottage stood in Pump Lane, a short distance from the post office premises proper, connected to them by a covered passage which afforded some protection from the more determined episodes of English weather. The cottage was a pleasant enough example of its kind, cream-washed, with a narrow front garden presently given over to the dormant skeletons of last summer's industry. The geraniums occupied a row of terracotta pots arranged along the front windowsill, and it was these that first arrested Miss Marple's attention as she came through the gate, which was indeed still standing open. The geraniums were drooping. They had not, she judged, been watered since at least the previous morning, and possibly longer. Agnes tended her windowsill with a regularity that matched her attendance at the post office counter. The soil in the nearest pot was dry to a depth that suggested a lapse of at least 36 hours. This was not the evidence of a planned departure, where one might arrange for a neighbour to water the plants, or at the very least remove them from the killing exposure of a cold February window. This was the evidence of a departure that had not been anticipated, or had been anticipated so recently and so suddenly that such domestic preparations had been overlooked. The front door was locked. Miss Marple did not try it, having been accompanied in her errand by Constable Fenn, a young man of earnest expression and limited imagination, who had been persuaded that a formal welfare inquiry was not only justified but necessary. He tried the door with official purposefulness, then proceeded around the side passage to the back, where the kitchen door yielded to moderate pressure, having been, as it turned out, merely pulled to rather than properly secured. They entered together, Constable Fenn first, as was appropriate. The kitchen presented itself as a room in a state of interrupted industry rather than abandon. On the table stood a wicker basket containing several items in need of mending, a grey wool sock with a hole at the heel, a pillowcase with a loosened seam, a handkerchief requiring a new border. The items were arranged in the basket with the natural orderliness of a woman who had set them out preparatory to an evening's work and had not, for whatever reason, begun it. Beside the basket sat a pair of scissors and a spool of grey thread, both placed with a precision that suggested intention rather than haste. The range was cold. The kettle contained water but had not been boiled. On the small table beside the window, a cup had been set out with its saucer and a teaspoon laid across it, as though in readiness for tea that was never made. Miss Marple moved through the kitchen quietly, touching nothing, observing everything. It was a room that told a comprehensible story if one attended to it with patience. Agnes had been here on Wednesday evening preparing for a quiet domestic night. Something had interrupted that preparation, or superseded it, before the tea was made. What had come between Agnes and her ordinary Thursday was not yet clear, but it was not, Miss Marple felt with increasing certainty, a planned excursion. The sitting-room was tidy in the particular way of rooms that are not frequently used for sitting. A small upright piano stood against one wall with its lid closed. The mantelpiece displayed a clock of no great merit and two framed photographs, one of a man whom Miss Marple supposed to be the late Mr. Pritchard, and one of a group of people standing before what appeared to be a seaside promenade, all of them squinting pleasantly into a summer sun. There was nothing in the room to indicate distress, argument, or the sort of urgent private emergency that sends a woman from her home without a word. It was in the sitting-room that they encountered the first of the people who had, it seemed, taken a particular interest in Agnes's situation. Mr. Charles Benton was standing outside the window, where Miss Marple looked up from her examination of the mantelpiece photographs. He was a tall man of perhaps 60, lean and upright in the manner of a person who has always been rather conscious of posture, with grey hair worn short and a face of contained, reserved expression that suggested considerable habit in the management of feeling. He was wearing a good tweed coat and carrying a hat, which he raised as their eyes met through the glass, with a courtesy that was entirely composed. Miss Marple had known Mr. Benton by sight for some 3 years, since he had come to St. Mary Mead following his retirement from some professional position in the city, the precise nature of which she had never established to her complete satisfaction. He had settled into Briarsgate, the house at the top of Church Road, with the smooth efficiency of a man well accustomed to organising his domestic affairs, and had proceeded to attach himself to village life with a measured selectivity that Miss Marple had observed with mild interest. He attended church with regularity, contributed to appropriate local causes, and maintained a particular attentiveness towards Agnes Pritchard that the village had noted on the whole, with a benign if speculative approval. Constable Fenn let him in through the back door, and Mr. Benton presented himself in the sitting-room with an air of calm concern that was entirely appropriate to the circumstances. He had, he explained, called yesterday afternoon and again this morning, and had grown sufficiently troubled to come around once more. He and Mrs. Pritchard had been on friendly terms, he said, and he had hoped she might have left a word with him before departing, if departing she had. He had received no such word. He was, he added, rather at a loss to account for it. His manner was measured and his words precisely chosen. Miss Marple, who had spent many decades listening to the way in which people deployed their words, noticed that he spoke of Agnes with a warmth that was sincere as far as it went, and that his concern was genuine as far as it was. But there was, beneath the composed surface, a quality of watchfulness, the particular alertness of a man who is waiting to learn something specific rather than simply hoping for news. She remarked mildly that Agnes had seemed perfectly well when she'd seen her Wednesday afternoon. Mr. Benton agreed that she had. She had seemed, he said, quite herself. He then added, with the small hesitation of a man selecting the correct weight of disclosure, that Agnes had recently had 1 or 2 matters on her mind of a practical nature, nothing of any consequence, merely the ordinary concerns of a woman managing her affairs alone. He had been glad to offer what guidance he could. Miss Marple expressed appropriate gratitude for this information. She remarked, almost to herself, that neighbours were so very valuable in precisely that way. One became relied upon, and that reliance was a kind of trust, was it not? Mr. Benton agreed that it was. He took his leave shortly afterward, with the grace of a man who sees no reason to prolong an unproductive interview. Miss Marple watched him go with her pale blue eyes and her needle still in her hands, for she had brought her knitting as she always did, and was presently working a complicated section involving a change of colour that required, in theory, a good deal of concentration, and in practice none whatsoever. Constable Fenn, who was a conscientious young man, asked whether she thought they ought to be concerned. Miss Marple considered the drooping geranium she could see through the window, and the half-packed mending basket on the kitchen table, and the cup and saucer set out in readiness for a tea that had never been made. She said that she thought they ought to be attentive, which was perhaps not quite the same thing, and that she would be very grateful if he would let her know the moment any word came from Agnes herself. She walked home along the lane in the thin February light, turning over in her mind the face of Mr. Charles Benton, and the particular quality of guidance that one offers to a woman managing her affairs alone. Chapter 3. Parish Pew Without Its Occupant. Sunday came to St. Mary Mead with its customary air of mild ceremony. The bells of St. Catherine's began their summons at 10:30, rolling out across the village with the unhurried authority of an institution that has never found occasion to doubt its own importance, and the lane filled gradually with the particular procession of persons that a village church draws to itself each week. The devout, the habitual, the sociable, and the occasional, all moving in the same direction with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Miss Marple walked to church as she always did, at a pace suited to the observation of her surroundings rather than the mere achievement of arrival. The morning was cold and pale, the sky the colour of old pewter, with a wind that came in measured gusts from the east, and discouraged any lingering at garden gates. One or two people fell into step beside her for portions of the route, exchanging the sort of remarks that February mornings provoke, comments upon the cold, speculations about snow, expressions of hope for an early spring that all parties understood to be more aspirational than informed. Agnes Pritchard's absence from the congregation was apparent before the service began. She occupied, in the ordinary course of events, the third pew from the front on the left-hand side, a position she'd claimed through 11 years of faithful attendance, and defended through the quiet but effective mechanism of simply always being there first. The pew was not, in any official sense, hers, but the village understood it to be hers in the more binding sense that matters in such communities, the sense of established custom. This Sunday morning it stood empty, which produced, in those who noticed it, scarce the particular mild discomfort of a familiar landscape from which a known feature has been quietly removed. Miss Marple noticed it, as she noticed most things, and settled herself into her own customary place with a thoughtfulness that her neighbours might have attributed had they been attending to spiritual preparation. The congregation included, among its usual complement, several persons whose connection to Agnes's disappearance Miss Marple had been turning over in her mind since Friday. Mr. Benton was present, seated towards the back in the manner of a man who has not yet quite committed himself to a particular pew, and therefore occupies whichever is convenient, which Miss Marple had observed was frequently the one that afforded the broadest view of the room. He sat with his hymn book open and his gaze composed, and if he was aware of Agnes's empty pew, he gave no sign of it that Miss Marple could detect from her angle of observation, which was, she admitted, not ideal. Miss Olive Harcourt occupied a seat near the middle of the right-hand side, which placed her, as Miss Marple reflected, in precisely the position of a person who has not yet decided where she belongs. She was a young woman of perhaps 30, recently arrived in St. Mary Mead as a lodger at Vine Cottage, where old Mrs. Fry let out rooms to supplement a pension of insufficient generosity. Miss Harcourt was slender and fair, with a quality of careful self-containment that Miss Marple associated less with shyness than with a habit of watching before participating. She had been in the village for 6 weeks, had introduced herself pleasantly to those she encountered, had offered no particular information about her previous circumstances, and had, as far as Miss Marple could determine, established a particular acquaintance with Agnes Pritchard in the course of those 6 weeks, which was perhaps not surprising, and as given that Agnes was among the more approachable inhabitants of the village, and that lodgers at Vine Cottage frequently passed the post office on their way to the shops. Mrs. Winifred Ames sat in her habitual place near the front, a position befitting her status as the most energetic of the church's working members. She was a stout and capable woman of 58, a widow of long standing, who organised the flower rota, the cleaning schedule, the annual sale of work, and the visiting of the sick with a comprehensive efficiency that the vicar found both invaluable and occasionally overwhelming. She had known Agnes Pritchard for the full 11 years of Agnes's residence in St. Mary Mead, and had regarded her with the particular fond exasperation of a woman who recognises a willing helper in another and occasionally works that willingness rather harder than the strict friendship might sanction. After the service, the congregation emerged into the pewter-grey morning with the slightly elevated sociability that a shared hour of hymns and reflection tends to produce, and gathered in the small informal clusters that the churchyard gravel always seemed to encourage. Miss Marple found herself beside Miss Harcourt with a naturalness that owed something, she acknowledged privately, to a degree of purposeful navigation on her own part. Miss Harcourt had noticed Agnes's absence, she said, when asked. She said it with a directness that Miss Marple appreciated. Many people, when one raised the subject of Agnes, had adopted a tone of carefully managed unconcern, as though the disappearance were a temporary inconvenience rather than a matter worth examining. Miss Harcourt simply said that she had noticed and that she was troubled by it. She had, she said, spoken with Agnes on Tuesday afternoon at the post office counter after the last of the other customers had gone. The conversation had been brief but had stayed with her. Agnes had seemed, she said, searching for the right word, preoccupied. Not unhappy precisely, but as though she were carrying a question she had not yet found the answer to. She had mentioned, in a rather abrupt manner unusual for her, that she supposed it was possible to think too much about a thing, and that sometimes a decision simply had to be made. Miss Marple inquired, with the gentle obliquity she had found over many years to be more productive than direct questioning, whether Miss Harcourt had formed any impression of what sort of decision Agnes might have been contemplating. Miss Harcourt was quiet for a moment. She was, Miss Marple noted, a person who considered before she spoke, which was, in Miss Marple's experience, a quality both rarer and more valuable than it ought to be. She said that she had not liked to ask, but she had gained the impression, from several small remarks Agnes had made over the preceding weeks, that Agnes had been feeling the weight of certain expectations. She did not use the word pressure. She used the word expectations, and she used it carefully, in the manner of someone choosing a word for its precision rather than its force. Miss Marple found this distinction interesting. She was presently joined by Mrs. Ames, who arrived with the momentum of a person who has several things to say and intends to say them. Mrs. Thine Ames had known Agnes longer than most, she reminded Miss Marple, and she could say with confidence that whatever people might suppose, Agnes was not the sort of woman to go herring off somewhere without a word. It simply was not in her nature. Agnes was, Mrs. Ames said firmly, a responsible woman, and responsible women did not behave irresponsibly. Miss Marple agreed, in the mild and receptive tone she reserved for people in the act of telling her something more useful than they realized. Mrs. Ames continued. She had seen Agnes on Wednesday, she said, at around 4 o'clock when she had stopped at the post office to collect a parcel. Agnes had been perfectly composed, perfectly pleasant, and had asked after Mrs. Ames's niece with the attentiveness she always showed. But as Mrs. Ames was leaving, she had noticed, and had thought it rather strange at the time, that Mr. Benton was waiting outside, not at the counter, outside, on the pavement, as though he had been there some while. He had gone in as Mrs. Ames came out, and he had given her, she said, a nod of such perfect pleasantness that she had thought nothing of it at the time. It was only now, in retrospect, that it struck her as perhaps worthy of remark. Miss Marple remarked that it was very often in retrospect that small things acquired their proper significance, and that Mrs. Ames had been very observant, which was both true and productive, as a statement of that variety generally proved to be. Mr. Miss Benton himself passed them at this point, raising his hat with the composed courtesy that Miss Marple was beginning to identify as one of his most constant characteristics. He paused to mention that he had made inquiries of the carrier who ran between St. Mary Mead and the railway station, and that the man recalled no passenger answering Agnes's description on Thursday morning. He offered this information with the air of a man contributing helpfully to a communal effort, and then moved on with the unhurried ease of someone who has nothing to conceal and knows it. Miss Marple watched him cross the gravel and pass through the lych gate. She thought about a man waiting on the pavement outside the post office as closing time approached, with the patience of someone who has learned that patience is its own form of persuasion. She thought about Agnes's empty pew and about a woman carrying a question she had not yet found the answer to. Then she drew her coat more firmly about her against the east wind and walked home for her Sunday luncheon, which Dotty had promised would include a very creditable leek soup, and which required, in Miss Marple's estimation, her full and unencumbered attention. Some things, she had long since concluded, were best thought about on a full stomach, and with the afternoon comfortably ahead. Chapter 4, Thread Drawn Through Ivory. Monday brought a return of the grey measured cold that February manages with such dispiriting consistency, and with it a development that gave the matter of Agnes Pritchard's absence a somewhat more considered shape in Miss Marple's thoughts. Constable Fenn had arranged, With the permission of the Postmaster General's regional office, a permission that had taken rather longer to obtain than the urgency of the situation perhaps warranted, for Agnes's cottage to be entered and examined in a manner more thorough than the brief visit of Friday morning had permitted, he had asked Miss Marple, with the slightly self-conscious diffidence of a young man who values an older woman's counsel, but is not entirely certain he ought to, whether she would consent to accompany him. He framed the invitation as though he were conferring a favour upon her, which was charming in its way, and she accepted it in the same spirit. The cottage in daylight had the particular stillness of rooms from which habitual activity is withdrawn. Sound seemed to settle rather than ring. The kitchen was precisely as they had left it on Friday, the mending basket on the table, the cup and saucer beside the window. Everything suspended in the instant of Agnes's departure, as a clock is suspended when its mechanism runs down. Constable Fenn applied himself to the practical business of opening drawers and examining the contents of cupboards with the methodical earnestness of a man following a procedure he has rehearsed rather than one he has previously performed. Miss Marple moved through the rooms at her own pace, pausing where instinct suggested, and passing on where it did not. It was in the small back bedroom, which Agnes had arranged as a combination of sleeping room and workroom, that Miss Marple found the object that absorbed her attention most completely. On the table beside the window, positioned beneath the better light, stood Agnes's sewing case. It was a thing of modest elegance, a rectangular box of dark blue cloth fitted with loops and pockets, containing the instruments of a careful needlewoman, scissors of 2 sizes, a thimble of worn silver, a pincushion in the shape of a strawberry that had seen considerable service, several spools of thread arranged by colour with a neatness that spoke of established habit, and, occupying the central and most prominent position, an embroidery frame of perhaps 10 inches across, mounted with a piece of ivory linen on which a pattern had been begun. The pattern was a simple one, a border of stylized leaves and small flowers intended, seen, by the look of the overall design sketched lightly in pencil on the fabric, to frame a central motif that had not yet been reached. The stitching that had been completed was fine and even, executed in the pale greens and soft blues of a person with a genuine feeling for colour and considerable patience. It covered perhaps 1/3 of the intended border. It ended in the middle of a leaf. The needle was still threaded, its tail of green silk secured through a small ivory ring at the side of the frame, in the manner of a needlewoman who intends to return shortly and wishes to keep her thread from tangling. The thread itself was drawn through the ring with a careful hand, and the ivory ring was turned slightly, as though the motion of securing the needle had been the last deliberate act performed before Agnes had risen from her chair. Miss Marple stood for some time looking at this arrangement, and she was not a sentimental woman, and she did not allow sentiment to cloud what was essentially an exercise in reading evidence. But she was a woman who had done a great deal of needlework in her life, and she knew with the authority of long practice what it meant when a piece was left in this particular way. One did not secure one's needle through the ivory ring, and draw the thread carefully through if one were leaving for an hour or even an afternoon. One did that when one expected to be away long enough for the thread to matter, long enough for an unsecured needle to work loose and the silk to tangle beyond saving. Agnes had known she was going somewhere. She had taken a moment before she went to preserve her work. She had not taken time to water the geraniums or to leave a note, or to boil the kettle for the tea she had set out. But she had secured her needle. Miss Marple found this illuminating in a way she did not immediately attempt to reduce to a simple conclusion. Instead, she filed it, as she filed most things that interested her, in the part of her mind she kept for observations whose significance had not yet declared itself, and turned her attention to the remainder of the room. The room yielded one additional item of interest. Constable Fenn discovered it, tucked between 2 books on the small shelf above the fireplace, a rather timid gesture of concealment that suggested Agnes had wanted it not immediately visible, but had not thought it necessary to hide it with any particular thoroughness. It was a folded paper, and upon the paper, in Agnes's neat, somewhat compressed hand, were several lines of arithmetic. The figures were not complicated, nor were they obscure. They represented, quite plainly, a calculation of Agnes's annual savings, her small investments as she understood them, and the approximate value of the post office cottage, which she held on a long lease. The figures were set out in 2 columns, one labelled in Agnes's hand simply as now, and one labelled as after. The after column was notably smaller than the now column. Constable Fenn looked at the paper with the expression of a young man who perceives that something is significant without being entirely certain what. Miss Marple looked at it with the expression of a woman who has perceived the same thing rather more rapidly, and is already thinking about its implications. She said after a moment that it was very kind of Constable Fenn to show her, and that she thought perhaps the paper ought to be kept safe. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that a woman who calculates the difference between what she has now and what she will have after some anticipated transaction has either made a decision or is very close to making one, and that the direction of that calculation, from more to considerably less, suggested that what was being contemplated was not an investment in the ordinary optimistic sense of the word. She thought about Mr. Benton, who had advised Agnes on financial arrangements, by his own admission, and whose admissions, she had noticed, were always offered with the ease of a man who has selected them in advance. She thought about the neighbour who had mentioned, when she had called in the previous afternoon, under the pretext of returning a borrowed preserve dish, that Agnes had been heard to speak of making things right before the month was out. The neighbour, a Mrs. Pooley of no great analytical tendency but reliable recall, had thought it an odd phrase, and had said so at the time. Agnes had not elaborated. Making things right was, Miss Marple reflected, a phrase of considerable ambiguity. It might express remorse, or resolution, or merely the determination to settle a practical matter that had been pending too long. It might mean something one owed to another person, or something one owed, more quietly, to oneself. She descended the narrow staircase ahead of Constable Fenn, and paused in the kitchen doorway, looking once more at the mending basket and the cup and saucer and the cold range. Agnes had sat in this room on Wednesday evening surrounded by the ordinary fabric of her ordinary life, and had been close, Miss Marple thought, to a decision of some consequence. Something had moved her to make it sooner rather than later. Something had tipped the balance from consideration to action. Miss Marple thought about patience as a form of persuasion. She thought about a needle secured through ivory, and thread drawn carefully through a ring. Then she thanked Constable Fenn for his trouble, wished him a good morning with sincerity, and walked home through the cold along a route that took her, without any appearance of intention, past the front of Briar's Gate, Mr. Benton's house at the top of Church Road. The curtains of the study window were drawn, though it was barely 11 o'clock. A small thing, no doubt. But Miss Marple had found, across a considerable number of years, that small things were frequently all there was to go on, and that they very seldom meant nothing at all. Chapter 5. Measured Steps Along the Gravel. Miss Marple had always found that the most productive thinking occurred not at a desk, nor even in the armchair by the fire, but in motion. There was something about the measured rhythm of walking that loosened the more obstructive tendencies of the conscious mind, and allowed the quieter, more perceptive faculties to come forward and say what they had been attempting to say all along. She had solved more than one difficult problem in the course of a perfectly ordinary walk to the lending library, and had arrived home with both a book she had not intended to borrow, and an understanding she had been reaching for all week. Tuesday morning found her therefore on the footpath that ran behind the church and along the northern edge of the village before curving back down towards the lane, a route of perhaps 40 minutes that took in the best of what St. Mary Mead offered by way of prospect in late February, which was, she acknowledged, not a great deal. The hedgerows were bare, the fields colourless, and the sky maintained its pewter consistency with a stubbornness that suggested no early intention of relenting. But the air was clean and cold, and the path was dry underfoot, and Miss Marple walked with the purposeful, unhurried step of a woman who knows exactly where she is going and is in no particular hurry to arrive. She was thinking about Mr. Charles Benton. She'd been thinking about him, in one degree or another, since Friday morning, when she had stood in Agnes's sitting room and watched him through the window before he came in. She'd observed, in the course of a long life spent in close attention to the inhabitants of a small village, a considerable variety of human temperaments, and she had arrived at certain conclusions about the patterns into which those temperaments organised themselves under the pressure of circumstance. Mr. Benton represented a type she recognised, not because she had met him specifically before, but because she had met the architecture of his character before, in different arrangements and different houses, and she knew its characteristic properties. He was a patient man. This was the quality she kept returning to, the one that seemed to her most significant, not patient in the passive sense of a man who simply waits for things to resolve themselves, but patient in the active sense of a man who has understood that patience, properly applied, is one of the most effective instruments of persuasion available. He had waited on the pavement outside the post office with the composure of someone for whom waiting was not an imposition but a strategy. He had offered his assistance to Agnes in matters of finance, and had continued to offer it across months, with a consistency that spoke not of spontaneous generosity, but of sustained intention. Miss Marple had known, in the course of village life, several men of broadly similar disposition. There had been a Mr. Hargreave 30 years ago now, who had attached himself with great patience and considerable outward warmth to an elderly widow on the Downley Road, assisting her with her correspondence, her accounts, her dealings with her solicitor, and her understanding of her own affairs, until the widow had arrived at the conclusion, entirely naturally and apparently of her own accord, that certain arrangements which benefited Mr. Hargreave were arrangements which also, in some manner she could not quite articulate, seemed right and proper. The widow had been, like Agnes, a woman of modest means, mild nature, and a fundamental dislike of conflict. The parallel was not exact. Parallels rarely were, but the underlying pattern was sufficiently similar to be instructive. The path brought her around the eastern edge of the churchyard, where the oldest headstones leaned at their comfortable angles among the winter grass, and she paused for a moment at the gate, not from any particular sentiment, but because the gate latch had a tendency to stick and required a moment's attention. As she worked it free, she became aware that she was not alone on the path. Doctor. Haydock was approaching from the direction of the lane, his black bag in hand and his coat collar turned up against the wind, which had sharpened in the last quarter hour. He was a man of 60 or thereabouts, broad-shouldered and direct in manner, with a face weathered by years of being called out in all weathers, and a habit of saying precisely what he thought that his patients had variously found bracing, alarming, and deeply reassuring, depending upon their temperament. He held the gate for Miss Marple with the automatic courtesy of a man who has good manners without making any particular point of them, and fell into step beside her along the path towards the lane. He had, he said, been thinking about Agnes. Miss Marple said that she had been doing the same, and waited. Dr. Haydock was not, as a rule, a man who needed encouragement to come to the point, and he did not need it now. He said that he had seen Agnes professionally in January, a routine matter. He had nothing of clinical concern, but she had seemed, in the latter part of the consultation, inclined to linger, which was unusual for her. She was ordinarily a woman who stated her complaint, received her advice, and departed with brisk efficiency. In January she had sat for an extra few minutes and had asked him, in a manner she clearly wished to sound casual and did not quite achieve, whether he thought it was ever reasonable to change one's mind about a practical decision after one had indicated a willingness to proceed. He had said, he told Miss Marple with the slight rueful air of a man reflecting on a conversation he would handle differently in retrospect, that it was always reasonable to change one's mind, and that she should do whatever seemed right to her when the time came. It had seemed a perfectly adequate response to a vague question. He was less certain of its adequacy now. Miss Marple said that it was a very sensible response, which was true, and which she offered without any softening intention, for she thought it genuinely had been sensible, given what he had known at the time. The difficulty, she observed mildly, was that the time for changing one's mind very often arrived with less warning than one anticipated, and that people who had indicated a willingness to proceed in certain matters sometimes encountered unexpected difficulty in actually withdrawing that willingness, particularly when the other party to the matter was a person of strong and steady temperament. Dr. Haydock looked at her with the expression of a man who has just heard something stated plainly that he had been approaching obliquely for several days. He said that Benton had struck him as a decent enough fellow. As Miss Marple said that she had no doubt he had struck a great many people that way, and left the observation to stand on its own, which it did perfectly well without assistance. They walked a little further in companionable silence. The lane came into view below them, and with it the rooftops of the village, smoke rising from several chimneys in the still, his cold air with the domestic reassurance of a scene that has been repeated in this corner of England for several centuries, and intends to continue for several more. Dr. Haydock asked whether she thought Agnes was in any danger. Miss Marple considered this question with the care it deserved. She said that she did not think Agnes was in physical danger, which was a specific and deliberate formulation. She thought Agnes was a woman who had found herself in a situation that had grown, through gradual and individually reasonable increments, into something she had not originally intended to find herself in, and that the strain of this discovery had impelled her to act, quickly and quietly, in the manner available to her. She paused, and then added that Agnes was not a foolish woman. She was a woman who had chosen, perhaps for slightly too long, to manage difficulty by enduring it rather than addressing it, which was a very common and entirely understandable approach, but one which occasionally produced a moment of sudden clarity, at which the managing and the enduring simply ceased. She rather thought, she said, that Agnes had had such a moment. Dr. Haydock nodded slowly, in the manner of a man absorbing a diagnosis he had suspected but not previously had articulated for him. They parted at the end of the church path, he towards his next call, and she towards the village. And Miss Marple walked the remaining distance home with the settled feeling of a person who's taken a piece of a pattern from one place in her mind and found that it fits, with a precision that produces a quiet satisfaction, rather more neatly in another. She thought about Agnes enduring, and managing, and then not doing either any more. She thought about Agnes securing her needle through the ivory ring before she went. And she thought about what, precisely, Agnes had decided to make right. Chapter 6. A Ring Turned Inward. Wednesday arrived in the manner of a day that has decided, without consulting anyone, to be slightly warmer than the days preceding it. The pewter sky softened fractionally, and by mid-morning a weak but genuine sun had appeared above the church tower, and was making a conscientious effort to justify itself against the cold. Miss Marple noticed it from her sitting-room window, with the appreciative attention she gave to all natural phenomena that signalled, however tentatively, the eventual retreat of February. She had spent Tuesday evening in the comfortable and productive activity of reviewing what she knew, which was a process she found easier to conduct with knitting in hand than without it. The needle's rhythm had a clarifying effect, as she had often observed, not unlike the way in which the motion of a train assists thought, by providing just enough occupation for the surface of the mind to leave the deeper parts of it free to proceed without interference. What she knew, when arranged with some care, amounted to rather more than the village at large appreciated. She knew that Agnes had been subject, over a period of some months, to the sustained and patient attentions of Mr. Charles Benton. She knew that these attentions had extended by Mr. Benton's own admission into the realm of Agnes's financial affairs. She knew that Agnes had performed a private calculation suggesting the anticipated diminishment of her modest savings. She knew that Agnes had spoken to Dr. Haydock of changing one's mind about a practical decision, and to Mrs. Pooley's hearing of making things right before the month was out. She knew that Agnes had secured her embroidery needle with the care of a woman who expected to be absent for some time, and she knew that Agnes had departed without watering her geraniums or leaving any note, which together indicated a woman in the grip of decision rather than crisis. What she did not yet know was the precise nature of the arrangement into which Agnes had been drawn, nor the degree to which Agnes had understood before her departure the full implications of what she had very nearly agreed to. It was Constable Fenn who brought her the next piece, arriving at her garden gate on Wednesday afternoon with the slightly self-important air of a young man carrying news and aware of it. He had been making further inquiries at the cottage, he explained, with the thoroughness that Miss Marple's evident approval of his earlier efforts had clearly encouraged. He had been systematic about it. He had gone through the remaining drawers of the bedroom chest with particular attention. In the lowest drawer, beneath 2 folded winter petticoats and a cardigan of pale blue wool, he had found a small object wrapped in a square of chamois leather. It was a ring, a slender band of modest gold, set with a single stone of pale aquamarine, the sort of ring that was neither ostentatious nor without quality, but occupied the dignified middle ground of a piece chosen for meaning rather than display. The stone was turned inward in the ring's resting position within the chamois square, facing down, so that only the plain gold of the band was visible from above. Miss Marple asked Constable Fenn to describe the size of the ring, and he did so after a moment's consideration, estimating it as a woman's ring of ordinary proportion. She asked whether the inside of the band bore any engraving, and he consulted his notebook with the look of a man grateful that he had thought to record this detail, and confirmed that it did. The engraving read, in small and somewhat worn letters, the single word together. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment after he had gone. She sat with her knitting in her lap and looked at the pale rectangle of February sunlight the window cast across the carpet, and thought about a ring that had been wrapped carefully in chamois leather and placed beneath folded winter clothing, and turned so that its stone faced inward and could not be seen. Agnes had never, to anyone's knowledge in St. Mary Mead, spoken of a previous engagement. She was a widow of 11 years' standing, and the late Mr. Pritchard had been the acknowledged fact of her past. That there had been someone else, at some earlier point, and that the evidence of that someone else had been preserved with such particular care and such deliberate concealment, was a fact of considerable human weight, quite apart from any bearing it might have on the present situation. But Miss Marple did not think it unconnected to the present situation. She had found, across many years of attention to human affairs, that the objects people keep in secret are very frequently the objects that explain them. She recalled a Miss Embry from many years past, a woman of similar temperament to Agnes, quiet and self-contained, who had kept a small photograph in the spine of a prayer book for 30 years without mentioning it to anyone. When the photograph had eventually come to light, after Miss Embry's death, then it had explained a great deal about the choices Miss Embry had made in the intervening decades. Choices that had puzzled those who knew her, and that had seemed, on the surface, to represent a consistent pattern of self-denial. The photograph had not changed the facts of Miss Embry's life, but it had illuminated the interior of those facts in a way that simple chronology had never managed. Agnes, Miss Marple thought, was a woman who had been alone for a long time, and who had arranged her solitude into something dignified and sufficient, in the manner of a person who has found that what is available can, with enough care and attention, become what is needed. And then Mr. Benton had arrived, with his patience and his offers of assistance and his quiet, steady pressure, and Agnes had found herself contemplating an arrangement that would resolve her solitude but diminish her independence, and had found the contemplation deeply uncomfortable, and had said nothing of the discomfort to anyone because she was the kind of woman who did not. Mr. Benton called that afternoon. He arrived at Miss Marple's gate at 3:30, which she suspected was not the coincidence it appeared, and she received him in her sitting room with a pleasant manner she reserved for conversation she intended to conduct with great care. He sat in the chair across from hers and accepted the offer of tea with a graciousness that was entirely natural to him, and they spoke for some minutes about the cold, and about the tentative sun, and about the village in general terms before the subject of Agnes introduced itself, as both of them had known it would. He had received no word from her, he said. He was, he said, increasingly concerned. He felt, he said, a particular responsibility, given the degree to which she had come to rely upon his guidance in certain practical matters. Miss Marple observed, as with the gentle precision she'd been refining for several decades, that Agnes had always struck her as a woman of considerable independence of mind beneath her quiet manner. Mr. Benton agreed, with the smooth readiness of a man who has anticipated the remark and prepared his response. He said that Agnes was indeed independent and that he admired it, but that independence, when carried to excess in a woman of her circumstances, could become a kind of vulnerability. There were matters, he said, in which inexperience was a genuine disadvantage, and in which a guiding hand was not a limitation but a protection. Miss Marple poured his tea and smiled, and said that she quite understood his meaning. She did, moreover, understand it entirely, which was perhaps not what he intended. She understood that he spoke of Agnes's inexperience as a disadvantage with the fluency of a man who had been finding it advantageous. She understood that guiding hand and protection were words chosen to present a particular arrangement in its most sympathetic light, and that the arrangement itself, whatever its precise legal contours, had been constructed with a patience and a persistence that left very little room, in practice, for the independence he professed to admire. He left at 4 o'clock, with the same composed courtesy with which he had arrived. Miss Marple saw him to the gate and watched him walk up the lane towards Church Road with the unhurried, deliberate step of a man entirely at ease with himself. She thought about the word together engraved inside a ring turned face down in a drawer. She thought that Agnes had perhaps understood, somewhere in the private country of her own heart, the difference between a companionship that was chosen freely and one that arrived through the slow accumulation of obligation, and that this understanding, arriving at last with sufficient clarity, had been what had finally moved her to act. The sun was gone again by 5 o'clock, and the pewter returned, and Miss Marple drew her curtains and sat by the fire, and thought that Agnes Pritchard, wherever she had gone, had been wiser than Mr. Benton supposed. Chapter 7. Conversations Beneath a Pale Sky. Thursday arrived with a change of weather that was, if not precisely cheerful, at least a departure from the relentless grey of the preceding days. A thin brightness suffused the morning, not enough to call sunshine with any conviction, but sufficient to lift the general aspect of the village from the merely cold to the merely wintry, which Miss Marple considered a meaningful improvement. The geraniums in her own kitchen window, which she had been tending with the particular solicitude one feels for plants in the season that tests them most, showed a faint gathering of colour at the tips of their stems that she chose to regard with optimism. She had slept rather better than she had expected, which she attributed partly to the progress of her thinking, and partly to the leek and potato soup that Dotty had produced on Wednesday evening, and which had been, as promised, very creditable indeed. She had arranged, with a naturalness that owed something to calculation, to call upon Miss Olive Harcourt at Vine Cottage on Thursday morning. The pretext was a book she had offered to lend, a collected volume of English watercolours that Miss Harcourt had admired during a previous visit, and which Miss Marple had subsequently located on the third shelf of her sitting-room bookcase, under a copy of Crockford's Clerical Directory, and a folded map of Somerset that had been there since an uncertain date. The book was genuine, the timing was considered. Vine Cottage occupied the near end of the lane that curved behind the post office, a positioning that Miss Marple noted with her customary attention to the geography of village acquaintance. One who lodged there and walked into the village by the most direct route would pass Agnes's cottage gate every time, which went some way to explaining the frequency with which a woman who had been in St. Mary Mead only 6 weeks had come to know the postmistress with a degree of intimacy that closer neighbours had not achieved in years. Miss Harcourt received her in the small sitting-room that Mrs. Fry's lodgings provided, a room furnished with the well-intentioned randomness of a landlady who had accumulated objects over many decades without a strongly governing aesthetic, and Miss Harcourt had added very little of her own: a folded shawl of deep amber across the arm of the better chair, a row of 3 books on the mantelpiece, a small botanical print propped above the fireplace, and these additions were sufficient to suggest a person of taste exercising a careful restraint in temporary circumstances. She accepted the book with a warmth that was entirely unperformed, and set it with evident pleasure on the table beside her own, and then looked at Miss Marple with the considering expression of a woman who suspects that the book, while genuinely welcome, is not the primary purpose of the call, and who is not, on reflection, unwilling to proceed on that understanding. Miss Marple remarked, settling into the offered chair with the ease of long practice in the art of making oneself comfortably at home in other people's rooms, that she had been thinking a great deal about Agnes, and that she had found Miss Harcourt's perspective at the churchyard on Sunday particularly illuminating, and wondered whether, in the days since, any further recollections had presented themselves. Miss Harcourt considered this for a moment with the honest deliberateness that Miss Marple had already come to recognise as characteristic of her. She said that there was one thing she had not mentioned on Sunday, not because she had wished to conceal it, but because she had not been certain at the time whether it was the sort of thing one mentioned, or whether it was the sort of thing one kept to oneself out of respect for another person's confidence. Miss Marple said, with entire sincerity, that this was a very reasonable distinction to make, and one that a great many people did not trouble themselves to make at all. Miss Harcourt appeared to find this encouraging. She said that on the Thursday of the previous week, which was the morning of Agnes's disappearance, she had risen early and had gone out at 7:30 for a walk before breakfast, as was her habit. Her walk had taken her, as it often did, along the lane past Agnes's cottage. The gate had been open, as they now knew it had been all that day. But Miss Harcourt had noticed something further that she had not reported to Constable Fenn, because she had not been asked precisely about Thursday morning, and because at the time she had not known that anything was amiss. She'd seen Agnes, not clearly, and not in circumstances that had seemed remarkable at 7:30, on what had appeared, then, to be an ordinary Thursday morning. Agnes had been at the side of the cottage by the gate that connected the small garden to the covered passage leading to the post office premises. She had been wearing her outdoor coat and carrying what appeared to be a small travelling bag, and the soft-sided kind that collapses when empty. She had been moving, Miss Harcourt said, with a quality of intention that was entirely different from the ordinary movement of a woman going about her domestic affairs, not hurried, but decided. Agnes had not seen Miss Harcourt, or if she had, she had given no sign of it, which was, Miss Harcourt said quietly, itself somewhat unlike Agnes, who was as a rule a woman who noticed people and acknowledged them. Miss Marple received this account with the composed attention she gave to pieces of information that confirmed rather than redirected her thinking. Agnes had left on Thursday morning early, with a bag she had packed in advance, with intention and without farewell. This she had suspected, that Agnes had been seen, and that the witness had said nothing for nearly a week, was notable primarily for the light it shed on Miss Harcourt herself, who had possessed this information and had weighed, carefully, the question of whether it was hers to offer. It was the behaviour of a person who takes other people's privacy seriously, which was a quality Miss Marple found both admirable and, in the present instance, mildly inconvenient. She asked gently whether Agnes had spoken to Miss Harcourt of Mr. Benton in any terms beyond those she had described on Sunday. Miss Harcourt was quiet for a moment, that was slightly longer than a moment required for simple recollection. She said that Agnes had spoken of him with an ambivalence that had struck her, at the time, as characteristic of a person who has received something she recognises as kindness, but finds she cannot receive with simple gratitude, because the kindness is entangled with something else that troubles her. Agnes had said on one occasion that she was not certain she had been as clear with Mr. Benton as she ought to have been at the beginning of things. She had not said what things, and Miss Harcourt had not pressed her. But she had said that she feared Mr. Benton had understood her situation as more amenable than it was, and that this misunderstanding, if that was what it was, had been building for some time into a structure she was not sure she had the authority to dismantle, without causing him a pain that would be, after all, her fault. Miss Marple found this passage of reported speech one of the most illuminating she had encountered in the course of the week. She turned it over in her mind with the careful attention she gave to a piece of knitting that had gone subtly wrong several rows back, and required patient analysis to identify exactly where the error had occurred, Agnes had believed, or had persuaded herself, that the misunderstanding was partly her own creation. She'd perhaps been warmer than she intended, or less decisive than the situation required, and had watched the structure of Mr. Benton's expectations rise upon the ground of her own insufficient clarity, and had found herself unable, by the ordinary instruments of polite conversation, to dismantle it without appearing to deal him an injustice. This was, Miss Marple reflected, an extremely common predicament, and an extremely painful one, and one that was almost never the fault of the person it afflicted most. She thanked Miss Harcourt for her honesty, which was genuine appreciation rather than ceremony, and took her leave as the church clock struck 11, walking home beneath the pale and tentative sky with the steady step of a woman whose picture of events is assembling itself, piece by careful piece, into something that begins to resemble the truth. She thought about Agnes, moving with intention through the gate at 7:30 on a cold Thursday morning, carrying a bag she had packed in the night. She thought about what it costs a woman of Agnes's disposition to decide at last. That a structure built upon her insufficient clarity is not, for all that, her obligation to inhabit. And she thought that the morning's thin brightness was, after all, more than she had credited it with being. Chapter 8. The small trunk beneath the bed. Friday brought rain, which was at least a change from the cold paralysis of the preceding days, and which the village received with the philosophical resignation of a community that has long since abandoned any expectation of February's goodwill. The lane ran with shallow rivulets. The church tower disappeared behind a grey curtain of mist. And Miss Marple's garden submitted to the downpour with the stoic passivity of bare earth that has nothing left to lose. She spent the morning indoors with her correspondence, a task she approached with the same methodical attention she gave to everything, answering 3 letters in order of their urgency and one out of order because it was from her niece, and contained a question that would not improve with delay. By 11 o'clock she'd sealed the envelopes, so set them by the door for the afternoon post, and turned her full attention to the matter that had been occupying the deeper levels of her mind throughout. Constable Fenn arrived at 11:30, damp at the shoulders, and carrying his notebook with the air of a man whose persistence has been rewarded, and who is reasonably pleased about it. He had returned to Agnes's cottage that morning for a further and more thorough examination. He had been systematic, he said, about the bedroom, going through it in a methodical grid that he had read about in a pamphlet on investigative procedure, and which had evidently given him considerable satisfaction to apply in practice. He had looked beneath the bed, beneath Agnes's bed, pushed to the far side against the wall in the manner of something placed there long ago and not regularly consulted, stood a small trunk of dark brown leather, the old-fashioned kind with a domed lid and brass fittings that had tarnished to a pleasant antiquity. It was not locked. Inside it were the accumulated documents and keepsakes of a life arranged with the instinctive archival care of a woman who understood, without articulating it, that the past requires stewardship. There were photographs, bundled and ordered. There were letters tied in 3 separate groups with 3 separate colours of ribbon, each group presumably representing a distinct correspondence and period of life. There was a small collection of programmes from theatrical and musical performances, a pressed flower of uncertain species, and a Bible with a name written on the flyleaf that was not Agnes Pritchard, but which Constable Fenn supposed had been her mother's. And there was a letter, unsealed, written in Agnes's own hand on 2 sheets of plain notepaper, addressed to a Miss Edith Crane of an address in Bath. Constable Fenn had copied it into his notebook, which Miss Marple considered a creditable initiative, and now read it to her with the slightly self-conscious delivery of a young man reciting something he recognises as private, and feels the weight of appropriating, however legitimately. The letter was not long. Agnes wrote with the economical precision of a woman who has composed her thoughts carefully before committing them to paper, and who has decided that what is necessary is to be said plainly, and what is not necessary is to be omitted. She told her cousin Edith that she was writing in advance of a possible visit, the timing of which she could not specify with any certainty, because circumstances had not yet arranged themselves into sufficient clarity for her to say precisely when. She said that she had been giving serious consideration to a matter that had occupied her thoughts for some weeks, and that she had come to feel, with an increasing conviction she now trusted rather than questioned, that the course she had been contemplating was not one she could in good conscience pursue. She did not say what the course was. She did not name Mr. Benton. She wrote around the matter with the particular obliqueness of a woman who has composed this letter, knowing that another person, Edith presumably, will understand its reference without requiring it spelled out, which told Miss Marple something instructive about the nature of the cousins' correspondence and about what Agnes had already communicated to Bath before the moment of departure. She said that she intended, if she found it necessary, to come away for a period, and that she hoped Edith would receive her, and that she was sorry to arrive with so little warning, but that the moment of decision, when it came, had rather less warning itself than she had anticipated, and she thought it better to act upon it than to allow it to pass unused. The final paragraph was the one that stayed with Miss Marple after Constable Fenn had finished reading, and had looked up with the expression of a young man awaiting interpretation. Agnes had written that she was not unhappy. She wanted Edith to know that. She was not in distress of the kind that required urgent intervention. She was, she said, doing what she should perhaps have done some months ago, and she was doing it now because she had come to understand that waiting for a better moment was a method of not doing it at all, and she had no more patience with that particular method. Miss Marple asked Constable Fenn whether the letter had been placed on top of the trunk's other contents or beneath them. He consulted his notes. Beneath them, he said, as though it had been placed there first at the bottom of the arrangement. This was significant in a way that required a moment's quiet appreciation. Agnes had written the letter and placed it in the trunk, and then arranged the other contents of her life's archive on top of it, and had at some point decided not to send it from St. Mary Mead, whether because she had not trusted the village post office's discretion, which with Agnes herself behind the counter had been considerable, but her absence might reasonably be expected to reduce, or because she had intended to send it from wherever she was going once she was there. The letter was both a preparation and an explanation, written for Edith, but also, Miss Marple felt, written for Agnes herself. The act of composing it had been part of how Agnes had arrived at her decision. Putting a thing plainly on paper had a clarifying effect that thinking alone rarely achieved. Miss Marple knew this from her own experience, and she suspected Agnes had discovered it in the composition of this letter, and had found, perhaps to her own surprise, that what she wrote was not uncertain at all. She thanked Constable Fenn with warm sincerity, and told him she thought he had done very well, which was true, and which she said in the tone that conveys genuine assessment rather than encouragement. After he had gone, she sat for some time with the rain against the windows and her knitting in her hands, working through what she now understood about the shape of Agnes's departure and the shape of what had preceded it. Mr. Benton had advised Agnes on her financial arrangements. He had encouraged, by his own admission, swift decisions regarding her affairs. Agnes had performed a private calculation in which the after column was smaller than the now. Agnes had told Dr. Haydock she was considering changing her mind about a practical decision. She had told Mrs. Pooley's hearing that she intended to make things right before the month was out. She had packed a bag in the night and left on Thursday morning with intention and without farewell, securing her embroidery needle as a small act of faith in her own return. And she had written to her cousin in Bath to say she was not unhappy, which was, Miss Marple reflected, the most carefully chosen statement of all, because it addressed directly and without being asked the question that a woman of Agnes's temperament would most wish those who cared for her to have answered. She was not a woman in crisis. She was a woman who had resolved one. The rain eased towards afternoon, and a pale and watery light spread briefly across the garden, illuminating the bare stems and the patient soil with an impartiality that found them equally worthy of attention. Miss Marple looked at her garden with the fond, a realistic eye of a gardener who knows that February's garden is not February's fault. She thought that Mr. Benton, whatever else might be said of him, had misjudged Agnes Pritchard rather fundamentally. He had seen a woman of modest means, mild temperament, and demonstrated willingness to accept assistance, and he had concluded from these properties that she was a woman who could be guided by increments so gradual as to feel like natural progress, as towards an arrangement that served his interest while appearing to serve hers. He had been patient, and he had been persistent, and he had been, by the evidence of the cottage kitchen with its cold range and its untouched sewing basket, very close to achieving the outcome he had designed. And then Agnes had had her moment of clarity, and she had acted upon it, and she had gone. Miss Marple found this, taken as a whole, rather satisfying. In the way that a narrative which has proceeded by its own internal logic to its proper conclusion is satisfying, regardless of whether all of its participants intended it to end where it did. She picked up her knitting and returned to a section she had left unfinished the previous evening, working with the calm, ordered attention of a woman who knows what she means to do next and intends to do it properly. Chapter 9. Recognition in the drawing room. Saturday arrived in a more conciliatory spirit than the week had offered, the rain having exhausted itself overnight and left behind a morning of clean, cold stillness that made the village look briefly as though it had been reconsidered and improved. The lane was washed to a pale brightness. The church tower stood against a sky of genuine if modest blue, and Miss Marple's garden presented its bare February architecture with a dignity that she found, in this better light, rather admirable. She had written a note to Mr. Benton on Friday evening, after Constable Fenn had gone, and the rain had settled into its steady, meditative rhythm against the windows. The note was brief and entirely proper in its expression, extending an invitation to take tea on Saturday afternoon at 4 o'clock, if he found himself at leisure, or she had given no reason for the invitation beyond the customary language of neighbourly sociability, which she knew and he would know was a convention that did not require interrogation. His reply had arrived with the morning post, a card of good quality, written in a clear and upright hand, accepting with pleasure. She spent the interval of the morning with her ordinary affairs, which had a pleasant way of providing, through their very ordinariness, a kind of mental preparation for the less ordinary business the afternoon would bring. She attended to the garden for half an hour, not because February offered much scope for useful intervention, but because the physical occupation of removing the season's accumulated debris from the borders had a clarifying effect upon her thoughts. She lunched moderately. She sat afterwards in her chair by the window and worked a considerable portion of the section of knitting she had set aside the previous evening, and by the time 4 o'clock approached she felt, in the way that she had learned over many decades to recognise and trust, entirely ready. Mr. Benton arrived at 3 minutes to the hour, which told her something she had not needed to be told but noted as confirmation. A man who arrives at 3 minutes to the hour for a social engagement has adjusted his departure with the precision of someone for whom punctuality is not a matter of courtesy, but of management. She received him in the sitting-room, which was warm and orderly, the firelight supplementing the afternoon's pale sun through the west-facing window, and the tea-things arranged on the low table with the attention to detail that Dotty, the who disapproved of any suggestion that her domestic arrangements might be inadequate, brought to such preparations. Mr. Benton settled himself into the chair she indicated, the same chair he had occupied on Wednesday, with the ease of a man who is comfortable in drawing rooms and who has learned to make himself so as a deliberate and practised accomplishment. They went through the first 10 minutes in the ordinary manner, the weather, which had indeed improved, the village, so, which had its usual complement of small developments, and the matter of Agnes, which introduced itself on this occasion through Mr. Benton's own initiative rather than Miss Marple's, which she noted without surprise. He said that he had been thinking a great deal about Agnes's situation, and that he had come to feel it was important to conduct himself with patience in the matter. He had concluded, he said, that Agnes had needed time and space to consider things at her own pace, and that he had perhaps, with the best of intentions, pressed for a degree of resolution that had exceeded what was comfortable for a woman of her particular temperament. He said this with the measured self-reflection of a man offering a carefully calibrated admission, one that acknowledged a marginal excess of eagerness, while thoroughly insulating the underlying intent from examination. Miss Marple poured his tea and said that she thought self-knowledge was a very valuable thing, and that it was not always easy to arrive at, which was quite true as a general observation and carried, in the present application, rather more specific weight than its surface suggested. She set down the teapot and looked at him with the mild, attentive gaze that those who did not know her sometimes mistook for the comfortable vagueness of an elderly woman enjoying a quiet afternoon. She said that she'd been giving a good deal of thought to Agnes herself, and that she hoped he would not mind if she shared one or two observations, because she had found, over a long life spent in a small village, that the things which went unsaid had a tiresome habit of remaining unsaid indefinitely, unless someone took the trouble to say them. Mr. Benton indicated, with a composed inclination of his head, that he did not mind at all. Miss Marple said that Agnes was, in her estimation, a woman of considerable quiet intelligence, who had spent 11 years building, from the material of widowhood and solitude, a life that was modest in its external dimensions but entirely her own in its interior character. She had her cottage, her work, her geraniums, her embroidery, and the small but genuine satisfactions of a woman who has learned to inhabit her circumstances rather than simply endure them. These were not, Miss Marple said, the satisfactions of a woman who lacked for anything essential. They were the satisfactions of a woman who had arrived, through some effort, at a form of sufficiency. Mr. Benton listened to this with the attentive expression of a man who is following a line of thought towards a destination he cannot quite see from his present position, and is reserving judgment about the journey. Miss Marple continued. She said that it was her observation, and she offered it, she said, with the full acknowledgment that she might be mistaken, though she did not in fact think she was, that Agnes had found herself, over the course of the past several months, in a position of considerable delicacy. She had received assistance from a person whose consistency and patience she had found, she suspected, both genuinely helpful and gradually pressuring, in a way that each individual instance of helpfulness could not have predicted, but that the accumulated weight of it over time had produced. She had come, Miss Marple thought, to feel that she owed a kind of reciprocity that had not been explicitly demanded but had been consistently implied, and that this implication had grown by slow degrees into something that felt rather like an obligation. She paused to take a sip of her tea, and Mr. Benton, who had been very still during this portion of the conversation, said in a tone of carefully maintained reasonableness that he had never intended Agnes to feel any obligation whatsoever. His assistance had been offered freely and continued freely without condition. Miss Marple said that she was quite certain he believed that, and she said it with a kindness that was entirely genuine, because she was in fact quite certain he did believe it, which was one of the more interesting aspects of the situation. She said that there was a particular kind of persuasion, and it was not, she thought, always conscious, in which one person's consistency of attention and care creates, in a person of more yielding temperament, a felt debt that the attentive person would be genuinely surprised to learn had accumulated. The debt was not created by any single act. It was created by the pattern of acts, by the steady application of generosity over time in the manner of a drip of water which does not, at any individual moment, seem capable of wearing stone, and yet does so given sufficient time and a consistent point of application. Mr. Benton was quiet for a moment that was longer than most of the pauses in their conversation had been. He said at last that he had hoped Agnes might find their potential arrangement mutually agreeable. He had hoped, he said, that she might come to see it as he saw it. Practical, companionable, and to her benefit as much as his own. Miss Marple said that she understood perfectly, and that she did not doubt his intentions were as he described them. She said that Agnes, however, had come to understand that agreeable and mutually agreeable were not always the same thing, and that the distinction, once perceived, had a tendency to clarify a great deal of other things rather rapidly. She refilled his cup, and they sat for a moment in a silence that was not entirely uncomfortable, which Miss Marple considered a reasonable outcome for a conversation of this kind. There was nothing accusatory in the room. There was nothing that could not be recalled without distress by either party. But there was, she felt, a comprehension on both sides that had not existed an hour ago, and she thought that comprehension, honestly arrived at, was very seldom a regrettable thing. Mr. Benton set down his cup at 4:20 and took his leave with a courtesy that was so consistent a part of his character as to function by now almost independently of intention. At the door he paused and said, with a directness that she rather respected, that he supposed Agnes would not be coming back to revise her testament. Miss Marple said that she rather thought Agnes would be coming back in her own time, with her own mind entirely her own, and that this was perhaps the most satisfactory version of the outcome available. He nodded once and went out into the Saturday afternoon, which remained to its credit bright and cold and entirely indifferent to human arrangements. Miss Marple stood at her window and watched him walk up the lane, and thought that he would recover his equilibrium, because men of Mr. Benton's temperament generally did, and that Agnes Pritchard would return to her cottage and her geraniums and her embroidery with the kind of composure that is not merely assumed but genuinely earned. She picked up her knitting from the arm of her chair, and found her place in the pattern without needing to count back, which she considered a small but legitimate satisfaction. The fire settled, the afternoon light moved across the wall, the village went about its Saturday. Chapter 10. After the silence settles. Agnes Pritchard returned to St. Mary Mead on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of March, which had arrived, as March occasionally condescends to do in England, with a warmth and luminosity that made the preceding weeks feel like something that had happened to a different village in a different season. The hedgerows were acquiring their first tentative green. The churchyard had crocuses. Miss Marple's garden, which had endured February with such patient austerity, was making up for lost time with a quiet but unmistakable energy that she found deeply gratifying. She heard of Agnes's return from Dotty, who had it from Mrs. Tilling, who had observed Agnes's arrival at the cottage with a travelling bag considerably fuller than the one she had left with, which Dotty considered a promising sign and said so with some emphasis. Miss Marple received this information with a composure that concealed, as her composure habitually did, a rather substantial degree of satisfaction. She did not call upon Agnes immediately. She was of the firm opinion that a woman who has been away and has returned on her own terms requires a period of quiet re-establishment before she's ready to receive visitors, however well-intentioned, and that this period ought to be measured in days rather than hours. She waited 4 days, which she considered the appropriate interval. And on the Saturday morning she walked to Pump Lane with a jar of her own preserved plums, and the straightforward pretext of welcoming Agnes home. The gate of Agnes's cottage was closed. The geraniums in the windowsill pots had been watered. Their stems carried a returning vigour that the fortnight of neglect had threatened but not extinguished. Agnes herself opened the door before Miss Marple had quite reached it, which suggested that she had seen her coming from the window, and her expression was one that Miss Marple read without difficulty: relief, and a kind of quiet gladness, and the particular wariness of a woman who is not yet entirely certain how her return will be received by those she has left behind. Miss Marple presented the plums and said that it was very good to see her looking so well, and Agnes thanked her and said that she was feeling very well. And they proceeded into the kitchen with the ease of two women who have moved past the necessity of explaining themselves to each other, and arrived at the more comfortable country beyond. The kitchen had been restored to its habitual order. The mending basket had been cleared. The items that had sat unattended upon the table for nearly 3 weeks had been dealt with. The sock mended, the pillowcase reseamed, the handkerchief finished with its new border, and presumably returned to use. The cup and saucer that had stood beside the window were back in the cupboard. The range was warm, They sat with tea, and the conversation proceeded at first through the gentler shallows of general inquiry. The journey back, the cousin Edith in Bath, who had received Agnes with a warmth that Agnes described with a fondness that suggested the visit had been more restorative than she had perhaps anticipated when she wrote the letter she had not quite managed to send. Then Agnes set down her cup and looked at Miss Marple with the direct, steady gaze of a woman who has had 3 weeks of quiet and honest thought and has arrived at several conclusions she intends to stand by. She said that she supposed Miss Marple knew rather more about the circumstances of her departure than most people in the village. Miss Marple said that she had formed certain impressions, which she had largely kept to herself, and that she hoped Agnes had found her time away as useful as it had appeared from a distance. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she said that she had been very foolish, not in the ordinary sense of doing something impetuous, but in the more wearing sense of allowing a situation to develop well beyond the point at which she ought to have addressed it, because she had not wished to cause disappointment, and had confused that reluctance with consideration for another person's feelings, when in fact it had been, primarily, a wish to avoid the discomfort of the conversation itself. Miss Marple said that this was a very honest assessment, and also an extremely common experience, and that the distinction between genuine consideration and the avoidance of personal discomfort was one that a great many otherwise sensible people spent considerable portions of their lives failing to make. Agnes smiled at this, a small and genuine smile, and said that it was somewhat comforting to hear it put that way. The matter of Mr. Benton was not discussed at any length. Agnes said only that she had given the relevant matters, her testament, her savings, and what she described, with a wry precision that Miss Marple found encouraging, as certain proposed arrangements for her future, careful independent consideration during her time in Bath, and that she had written to her solicitor before her return, and that things were, as she put it, as they should be. She said this with the composed finality of a woman who has closed a door and has no intention of reopening it, and Miss Marple respected the finality entirely. The village, to its credit, absorbed Agnes's return with a minimum of open speculation. This was partly because Mrs. Winifred Ames had taken an early and firm position that Agnes had been visiting family, and that there was nothing whatever to remark upon, a position she advanced with the vigour of a woman who knows perfectly well there is a great deal to remark upon, and has decided that remarking upon it would serve no one. St. Mary Mead was wise enough on most occasions to recognise this variety of firmness and comply with it. Mr. And Benton continued to attend church on Sundays, and to greet his neighbours with the composed courtesy that had always characterised him. He and Agnes exchanged, when occasion required it, the pleasantries of people who know each other slightly, and have no particular cause for warmth. It was, Miss Marple thought, a better resolution than several alternatives she could envision, and she gave it the quiet approval she reserved for outcomes that, while not precisely happy in every particular, were honest and sustainable, and respected the dignity of all concerned. Miss Olive Harcourt remained at Vine Cottage through the spring, and Miss Marple thought she would stay rather longer than she had perhaps originally intended. She had found, it seemed, the kind of quiet to which some natures are particularly suited, and St. Mary Mead, for all its small dramas and limited prospect, was not entirely without its appeal to a woman who valued observation over event. On a mild evening near the end of March, Miss Marple sat by her sitting-room window as the light softened across the garden and the early daffodils came into focus against the dark border, in the particular way that evening light confers upon the yellow flowers a quality approaching luminescence. She had her knitting in her lap, a section of considerable complexity that she was navigating with the practised ease of long familiarity, and she was thinking, as she occasionally still did, about the voice she had heard in the dark corridor on the morning of Agnes's disappearance. She did not think it had been supernatural, nor had she ever seriously entertained the possibility. She thought it had been recognition, as she'd come to call it to herself. The mind's habit of arriving at a conclusion before the conscious intelligence has assembled sufficient evidence to justify it. The way in which something known but not yet understood announces itself through the thinner membrane of a waking dream. She had heard Agnes in that sound, she thought now. Not Agnes's voice precisely, but something of Agnes's situation, which had perhaps been apparent to her in the expression on Agnes's face the preceding afternoon, and which her sleeping mind had drawn forward and named before her. Waking one had managed to do so. She had found, over a very long life, that intuition of this kind was almost never supernatural. It was simply the mind being more efficient than one gave it credit for, proceeding along the available evidence to a destination that reason, encumbered by its own propriety, had not yet permitted itself to reach. The daffodils moved slightly in the evening air. The church clock struck 7 with the comfortable authority of an institution that has been striking 7 in this village